Is Drew Hendricks. I was a cop watcher in Olympia, Washington from 2003 or so until 2009, basically, 2010. PMR, or as we called it, Port Militarization Resistance, was an organized activity to resist the county's complicity in the military invasion of Iraq and then later Afghanistan going on. They were moving military equipment through the port of Olympia to the occupation in Iraq. Later on, there was equipment coming back as well. And we wanted to at least be on record, if not directly blockade that equipment, so that on some level we wouldn't be liable for that. And, you know, maybe if enough people caught on to the idea, we could actually stop the war. Yeah. Well, Towery worked for about 2 years within Port Militarization Resistance, about 2.5 years within SDS Northwest. He was also so-called founding member of Movement for a Democratic Society in the Northwest. I found Towery by doing cataloging. Cataloging is taking open source information and comparing it to public records information. So for instance, finding all of the email addresses in an email chain between the city of Olympia and the port of Tacoma or Pierce County Sheriff's Office, and looking at those email identities and cataloging each one. So we're finding, in this case, voter registration records, property ownership records, trying to get first name, last name, address on everybody in that email chain. And in so doing, I came across an identity who was named John J. Towery, and realized that he lived in a town very close to a guy that I knew as John Jacob. And pretty much realized that John J. Towery might be John Jacob Towery, as we later found out it was. So once I found him, once I put together who he might be and how he'd contacted us and who he'd been involved with, that his access could explain a lot of what we were seeing in terms of the spying, the shadows, I should say, of what had been going on. And once I had figured out it was probably him, it took me about a month to actually get photographs that proved it was him. Then we went public with it. That was a bit of a shitstorm. Well, if your state has a public records law that lets you look at public records, your country certainly does. If you live in the United States, there's a Federal Freedom of Information Act. In Washington State, it's called the Open Records Act or the Public Records Act in its various incarnations. We have pretty strong public records law. It's easy to go get public records. If you get public records, then cataloging them is the key. What I do is when I get a passel of emails, I read through every single one and all of the attachments. And the important part about doing that is you're going to come across stories you didn't know you're looking for. I wasn't looking for the Hemisphere program when I found it. I was looking for the domestic terrorism program of the Washington State Patrol, which was a program that they used to spy on activists in Washington State. So while trying to research that, I found something that actually gave cell phone locations and contact history data for everybody in the United States to any gang investigator that was in any way linked to DEA. Not just drug enforcement agents, but gang investigators. That includes people who are looking at anarchists, people looking at protesters, people who are looking at anybody who travels interstate to do a protest could fall into that list very easily. And so read all the emails, look at the keywords, Google stuff that you're not familiar with, figure out what it is, get to know the names of everybody on your local police department. And when I move to a new area, I always get a list of who the cops are. The next step after that is I match it up to my voter registration database and see where they live. Once I know where they live, I look up the ownership data and see how much their house cost and who owns their house. Are they renting? Are they owning it? Do you have somebody on a $30 an hour salary that's in a $2 million house? You know, if you know something about your local law enforcement in terms of how much money they're spending and how they're living, you know which ones are corrupt and which ones aren't. And that narrows down the list quite a bit on which ones you need to look at and which departments you can, you know, cooperate with and figure out, you know, who's doing what.
Guild based in Bellingham, and the two activists who have exposed this story through their Freedom of Information Act requests, Brendan Maslauskas-Dunn, Olympia-based activist, and Drew Hendricks as well. Thank you both very much for being with us. That does it for our broadcast.